On March 25, 2026, at the United Nations General Assembly, the world was asked a question it has avoided for centuries. It was about the transatlantic slave trade, but it wasn't just what happened during it, but what is still owed because of it. 123 countries said yes, others stayed silent, and a few said no. For 400 years, millions were enslaved. For decades, the world has acknowledged it, but when asked to apologize and also pay, critically some of the most powerful countries directly involved in it still say no. So why can you recognize a crime but still refuse to take responsibility to those affected years later? I'm Afzal Ahmed and this is Aloud. This show brings you articles made for audio. In this episode, we've adapted the piece, A 400-Year-Old Debt, Ghana's UN Move and the Dark Legacy of the Transatlantic Slave Trade by Ali Bilgen Olu, published on TRT Africa English on March 30th, 2026. The resolution led by Ghana did more than acknowledge history. It formally condemned the forced displacement and enslavement of millions of Africans over 4 centuries, calling it the gravest crime against humanity. But it went further. It called on states to issue official apologies, to contribute to a reparations fund, and to return African artifacts and archives looted and now held in Western institutions back to their countries of origin. But rather than it focusing on the substance of the resolution, much of the attention has turned to those who opposed it, because key Western powers, the United States, the United Kingdom, and every European Union member showed little willingness to accept responsibility, despite their central role in the system being condemned. To be specific, it was the United States, Israel, and Argentina who rejected the resolution. Former colonial nations such as the Netherlands, Portugal, Spain, Britain, France, and Italy were among those who abstained. The countries that opposed or distanced themselves from the resolution argued that international law does not apply retroactively. You cannot hold modern states legally accountable for actions that were not defined as crimes before. They also argued that international law should not allow for the creation of a hierarchy of crimes. Labeling one atrocity as the gravest minimizes the suffering of victims of other genocides or crimes against humanity. The United States was blunt, saying the UN was not created to advance narrow specific interests or create expensive new mandates. Europe acknowledged the unparalleled tragedy, but insisted any reparatory framework must stay within existing international law. But for those pushing for justice, these arguments missed the point, and there is precedent too. In other parts of the world, reparations have been paid. Germany, for example, has compensated Holocaust survivors, and more recently acknowledged and pledged financial support over its colonial-era genocide in Namibia. Supporters argue if reparations are possible in some cases, why not here? For the Global South and the African Union, this was a reparatory justice finally on the world stage. For the West, it was seen as an attempt to reopen history books with modern price tags and a potential precedent that could stretch far beyond slavery. Let's go back to understand the gravity of the crime of the transatlantic slave trade. For nearly 400 years, from the early 16th century to the late 19th, around 13 million Africans were forcibly removed from their homes. It was the largest system of forced migration and human trafficking in history. An estimated 2.5 million people died over the period, on ships, in confinement, in conditions so brutal. But what made this system so powerful was its design, called the triangular trade. From Europe, Portuguese, British, Spanish, and French merchants sent manufactured goods like weapons, gunpowder, textiles, and alcohol to Africa. In what is called the Middle Passage, enslaved Africans, sometimes acquired from local tribal chiefs and indigenous traders in exchange for these goods, were transported to the Americas. Other methods included carrying out raids and kidnappings both by the Europeans and the local collaborators. And in the Americas, enslaved Africans were forced into relentless labor, producing sugar, cotton, tobacco, and coffee. Raw materials and slaves were then shipped back to Europe, completing a cycle built entirely on exploitation. This system generated profit and built economies. Historian Eric Williams argued that the wealth generated from slavery helped finance Britain's Industrial Revolution. Another historian, Joseph Inokori, pointed to the expansion of global markets driven by slave-produced goods, fueling shipping, banking, and insurance. Institutions that still exist today trace their roots back to this period, such as insurance marketplace provider Lloyd's of London due to the need for risk management, and Barclays Bank from the merger of local banks and insurance companies established to manage the high risks associated with the slave trade. Cities like Liverpool and Bristol grew rich from the trade. The infrastructure, institutions, and universities were directly funded by the profits of slavery. Across the Atlantic, the story follows a similar path. It would not be an exaggeration to say that the early wealth of the United States was entirely based on slave labor. In the South, plantation economies thrived and became a global power thanks to the forced labor of enslaved Africans. In the North, industries and financial systems expanded using the profits generated by that labor in the South. Different regions, different roles, but part of the same system. Modern American capitalism developed alongside slavery, not apart from it. But while wealth accumulated elsewhere, Africa was being depleted. The majority of those taken were between the ages of 15 and 45, the most productive segment of society and its future. Their loss disrupted agriculture, craftsmanship, and family structures. Over time, this caused the socio-economic collapse of the region. Historian Walter Rodney attributes Africa's systematic impoverishment, loss of human capital, and dependence on Europe entirely to the era of European colonialism. Modern research reinforces this. Economist Nathan Nunn gives examples of the correlation between intensive slave trade and structural poverty. Drawing on historical data, he identified a clear correlation. Countries like Benin, Angola, Congo, Sierra Leone, and Nigeria, all central to the slave trade and known as the Slave Coast, continue to face all sorts of challenges, while regions less exposed have remained relatively more stable, like Botswana, which were harder for slave traders and their ships to reach.
Therefore, draft resolution A/80/L48 is adopted.
And this brings us back to the United Nations. Ghana's resolution represents more than recognition. It is a demand to confront history, to acknowledge its consequences, and to act on them. Despite the resolution not being legally binding, no court can compel a check or return order, no treaty can force an apology, but the transatlantic slave trade is now recognized as the gravest crime against humanity. That much the majority of the world now agree on. But recognition without accountability from those at the heart of it changes very little, even if their success may have been built on the back of it. Because if a crime this vast, this deliberate, does not require apology, does not require repair, then what does? The vote at the United Nations didn't just revisit history, it exposed a divide between those who see the past as finished and those still demanding justice, however many years it may take. That's all for this episode of Aloud, based on the piece, A 400-Year-Old Debt, Ghana's UN Move and the Dark Legacy of the Transatlantic Slave Trade, by Ali Bilgen Olu, published on Tiate Africa English on March 30th, 2026. I'm your host Afzal Ahmed. Thanks for listening.